Welcome back guys, Jimmy Jules here again with another CREY prop tutorial. In today's episode, we'll be going over the player manager prop. On the screen at the moment is of course the player manager, and I'll be taking you through the settings first, and then some examples later. The first thing to note is that these first batch of settings that we go through each have an input, which means we can change their values in-game with signals. The first setting we have is the run speed for your character. This will determine how quickly your character will run throughout your game. You can see at the moment this is set to 13. Beneath the run speed is the acceleration time. This is measured in seconds and will determine how quickly our character reaches their run speed. By default, the character will reach the maximum speed of 13 in half a second. Just below the acceleration time, we have the stop time, which is how quickly our character will decelerate from whatever speed they're running. So by default, they'll come to a stop after 0.6 seconds. The jump height is of course how high your character can jump, and we would increase this to make them jump higher and decrease it to make the jump lower. The jump time is the amount of time the characters are in the air before they land. The extra jump setting indicates how many extra jumps our character will be able to do after they're off the ground initially. Just note that your initial jump off the ground doesn't count towards your extra jumps, so you can set this to 0 and you'll still be able to jump, but you won't be able to double jump. Having this set to 1 will enable double jump. The mass setting indicates how easily your character will be able to move physical objects in your game. I'll show this with an example shortly, but basically the more mass they have, the more ability they will have to move physical objects. We also have the lives setting, which sets how many lives our characters are going to start out with. By default this is 3, but you would just change this to however many lives you would want your character to have. Just under that we have the max health option. This indicates how much damage our character will be able to take before they die and lose a life. We set how much damage is done to the character with the damage prop. That's the first batch of settings that we'll go through, and remember each of these settings has an input, so we can change these values in-game. Just underneath all the inputs we have the current health output, which outputs how much health the player currently has. Next we have the death effect. When this is enabled, it will show an effect when the character dies. If it's disabled, when the player dies, they'll disappear without anything happening. Underneath this, we have the 2D movement setting, which automatically restricts our player's movement to a 2D plane. Again, I'll show you an example of this very shortly. We also have the blob shadow option. You can see that when I have this enabled, there's a black dot shadow underneath the character, which isn't there when that setting is disabled. And finally, down the bottom, we have the multiplayer setting. If this is enabled, all of the inputs and outputs will become per player. This means that if you have a multiplayer game, each of your characters will have their own player manager, so they'll have, for example, their own health. This also goes for the rest of the settings in the prop, and I'll show you what we might be able to do with that setting with one of the setups that we've got. First of all guys, I'll take you through a couple of the settings down the bottom. You can see here I've got the current health plugged directly into a number displayer. This number is showing down the bottom left of the screen, and it's just that 100 number there. I've got a damage prop set up around this apple tree, for some poison apples or something, so that when our character is around this tree, they'll lose health. So if I step near this tree, you'll see the current health output has changed from 100 to 50 and has sent that signal to our number displayer. I can also show you the death effect setting here. So you'll see when our character dies, an effect will play. I'll just show you that once more. Whereas if we have the death effect turned off, the character will just disappear. As for the 2D movement setting, this will automatically restrict our player's movement to a 2D plane. So if I enable this, you'll see that the character is no longer able to move forwards and backwards, but only right and left. That's not bad, but it would be great if we could restrict them from moving up and down at all. I've got a quick 2D setup here, just with a camera that's set to follow the player. All the other settings on this are default. And I've also got two input triggers. These input triggers are set to the forward and backward keys, and they also have the lock player option enabled. This will mean that it will prevent the player's character from being affected by the forwards and the backwards key presses. And with the camera enabled, you can see we can move right and left just fine, but if I press up or down, nothing happens at all. This is just a quick way to add a bit of extra polish to your 2D game if you're making one. The next example I'll take you through is the mass setting. If I run up against this wall, nothing happens whatsoever. You can see up the top left that my mass is currently 1. I've got a pickup here disguised as a box, and when you run over that pickup, it increases your mass. Now that we have that, if we run up against this wall again, you'll see the blocks are moved out of the way. So again, the mass setting indicates how capable our character will be of moving physical objects. This setup is fairly simple. I've just got it boxed up in our mass increase box here. So really, all there is to this one is a variable's value being assigned to the setting in the player manager. So by default, I've got the mass at 1. Then whatever number is assigned to our variable is then added to 1 to increase our mass setting. For the pickup, I've again got this boxed up, and we're using the same setup as usual, with a sensor around the pickup object. That sensor activates a counter to make the signal permanent, and then that signal turns on a hider, which disables the sensor and the pickup box. This counter also sends a signal to our signal converter to turn on our variable modifier, and this time it's setting our mass increase variable to 49. Because our mass was originally 1, it will add the 1 and the 49 together with the calculator and make it an even 50. So not too complex of a setup, but you can lock away certain areas for people until they've done certain things in your game. The final setup we'll go through here is a bit of a speed boost. These boxes here I've set up to give your character a temporary speed boost so they can run much faster. This speed boost lasts for 2 seconds and then they'll slow back down again. So you can see at the moment I'm running normal speed, then I'll grab a pickup, I'll get a big speed boost, and then I'll slow back down again. I can pick up another one, and the same thing will happen. So how does that work? Well, you can see with our pickup we've got the exact same setup, but instead this variable modifier is changing our speed boost variable to 1, and it's setting it to 1. This is the setup at the other end to control the timing and the speed change. Now remember, by default, our speed is at 13, so I've added 13 into our calculator value B, so that when there's no signal going into value A, by default, the run speed will be 13. This calculator will then add any signal it receives to the default run speed and increase it. This variable here just changes between a 1 and a 0 to indicate whether the speed boost is active or not. We've then got this calculator here multiplying the output of the variable by 50. So for example, if the speed boost is off, the calculator will process 0 times 50, which is 0. So it will add no additional run speed. When our variable changes to a 1, the calculator will process 1 multiplied by 50, which is 50. So it's going to add 50 to our default run speed, and then pump that value directly into the run speed setting. So that's all we need to change our character's run speed, but then what do we do to time that and then set it back to normal after a period of time? This calculator here is controlled by the calculator that's outputting our run speed, and all that it's checking is whether the current run speed is greater than the default run speed. If our current run speed is greater than 13, then it will know the speed boost is active and start the timer. We've got this plugged into a signal converter, so when our run speed is greater than 13, the signal converter will activate our timer. We've got the version 1 prop power signal plugged directly into this timer. The timer is set to count up for 2 seconds, and once it has completed that 2-second count up, it will activate the second signal converter, which will then power on our variable modifier to set our speed boost back to 0, which will then disable the speed boost. The player is then able to pick up another speed boost, and this process repeats. With this speed boost setup, You could make a multiplayer speedrunning game by enabling the multiplayer option on both the variable for the speed boost and on the player manager. This would ensure that each player gets a separate copy of the variable and a separate copy of the player manager, so that if one player picked up a speed boost, the rest of the players in the game would not receive the same effect. It would only affect the player that picked up the object. These have been a few examples with just a couple of the settings available on the player manager, but remember, you can manipulate any of these values and give your character specific abilities at specific times in your game. Anyway guys, that's just about all for the player manager. If you have any questions at all, definitely leave a comment. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.